A gang bullies a boy, not realizing that Chuck Norris is around. Subscribe and comment where you're watching us from. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a faint orange and pink glow that stretched across the sky. The remnants of daylight clung stubbornly to the scattered clouds, but the darkness was slowly creeping in, swallowing the colors of the evening. The temperature had begun to drop, and the crisp air carried the distant sounds of a quiet town settling into the night. The streets were mostly empty, the last few stragglers making their way home before the town became truly deserted. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting their dim yellow glow over the cracked sidewalks and lonely intersections. Some buzzed faintly as they struggled to stay lit, their aged bulbs barely holding on. The occasional passing car sent beams of headlights stretching across the pavement before disappearing into the distance. It was the kind of quiet that only came in places like this, a forgotten town on the outskirts of something bigger, where life moved slower and the roads stretched long and empty. A boy walked along the side of the road, his shoulders slightly hunched against the evening chill. He wasn't old enough to drive, not yet, but he was old enough to walk home alone. He had done it countless times before, ever since his mother had started working late shifts at the local diner. His school bag was slung over one shoulder, slightly too heavy with books and papers. In his other hand, he carried a small package, carefully wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a gift, something he had saved up for over the past few months, picking up small chores and errands for neighbors. It wasn't much, just a simple trinket from the town's general store, but it meant something to him. It was for his mother, a thank you for everything she did. The road stretched ahead, leading past the old gas station that sat just before the turn toward the residential streets. It wasn't much of a place, just a couple of pumps, a convenience store with a flickering neon sign, and a single rusted-out pickup truck parked near the front. The station was the last bit of civilization before the empty stretches of highway beyond. At this hour, it was mostly deserted, save for a lone figure standing by one of the pumps, refueling his vehicle. The boy didn't pay much attention to the man at the gas station. He was too focused on getting home before it got too dark. His mother always worried when he was out late, and he didn't want to give her a reason to stress. He quickened his pace slightly, adjusting his grip on the package. His breath puffed out in small clouds in the cool evening air. Then he heard it. The deep, throaty rumble of engines. Not just one, but several. The sound rolled over the quiet town like distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second. The boy's stomach tightened. He knew that sound. Everyone in town did. A gang of bikers. They weren't from here. They passed through every now and then, never staying long, but long enough to make their presence known. People talked about them in hushed tones, how they would drink, cause trouble, pick fights at bars, and leave a trail of destruction in their wake. Nobody wanted to cross them. They were the kind of men who thrived on intimidation, who enjoyed the feeling of people shrinking away when they entered a room. The boy swallowed hard and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing roar of engines behind him. Maybe they wouldn't notice him. Maybe they were just passing through. The first motorcycle roared past, the rider barely sparing him a glance. But the others slowed down. Tires crunched against the pavement as 5 more motorcycles pulled up beside him, forming a loose semicircle. The riders weren't young men looking for a thrill. They were older, hardened, their faces weathered from years on the road. Their leather jackets were worn, some patched with emblems and insignias that marked them as part of a larger, more dangerous group. One of them, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and a scar running down his cheek, let out a low chuckle. The boy didn't dare look up, but he could feel their eyes on him. The motorcycles idled loudly, engines grumbling like restless beasts waiting to be unleashed. The smell of oil and gasoline mixed with the lingering scent of cigarette smoke clinging to the biker's clothes. The boy's fingers tightened around the package in his hand. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to keep walking. If he ignored them, maybe they'd get bored and move on. But they didn't. Instead, the first biker turned his handlebars, cutting him off. The boy stopped abruptly, nearly stumbling. He looked up, finally meeting the man's gaze. The biker grinned, a cruel, amused smirk that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. "Where you off to, kid?" The words were casual, almost friendly, but the boy knew better. The others laughed under their breath, exchanging glances. One of them leaned forward on his bike, his gloved hands resting on the handlebars as he studied the boy like a cat sizing up a trapped mouse. The boy's mouth felt dry. His legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to move. He glanced to the side toward the gas station. The lone figure near the pump was still there, seemingly unaware of what was happening, or maybe he was just waiting. The boy took a slow, shaky breath. He could hear his mother's voice in the back of his mind, reminding him what to do when facing trouble. Don't make eye contact, don't give them a reason, just keep moving. But they weren't going to let him. The man in front of him revved his engine slightly, making the motorcycle growl. The others chuckled. Then one of them reached out and snatched the package from his hand. The boy's eyes widened in horror. "No." The biker unwrapped the paper carelessly, letting it fall to the ground. Inside was a small, delicate glass figure. It caught the dim light from the street lamp for only a second before the man sneered and let it slip from his fingers. The glass shattered against the pavement. The laughter grew louder. The boy's fists clenched at his sides, his eyes stinging. He wanted to yell, to fight, to do something, but what could he do? He was just a kid. One of the bikers grabbed his school bag, yanking it off his shoulder. Books tumbled out onto the ground, pages fluttering in the wind. Another kicked one of them, sending it skidding across the pavement. More laughter. More taunts. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. Then, all at once, the laughter stopped. The air changed. The boy felt it before he saw it. Something in the atmosphere shifted, like a storm rolling in. The biker's amusement faded, replaced by something else. A presence. The boy slowly opened his eyes. The man from the gas station was walking toward them. Not rushing, not running, just walking. Calm, steady, and with each step, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sound of the glass shattering against the pavement rang in the boy's ears, louder than the rumbling motorcycles, louder than the jeering laughter surrounding him. It was just a simple trinket, something he had saved up for, something that had meaning. And now, it lay in broken shards on the cold asphalt beneath the sneering gaze of the bikers. The boy's fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, telling him to stay calm, to not engage. But how could he? His books were scattered across the ground, his backpack torn from him, and the gift, the one thing he had been excited to give, was gone, crushed beneath the careless fingers of a man who found amusement in his pain. A rough shove from behind nearly sent him stumbling forward. One of the bikers had stepped off his motorcycle, towering over him with an expression that mixed boredom with cruelty. The man didn't need a reason to do this. He was doing it simply because he could. The others watched, entertained, waiting to see how far things would go. The boy swallowed the lump in his throat and bent down, reaching for his books. Maybe, if he moved quickly, if he didn't react, they would lose interest. A heavy boot slammed down on his hand, pinning it to the ground. The boy gasped, wincing at the sudden pain. He yanked his hand back, barely pulling it free before the pressure increased. The biker above him chuckled. "Look at him," another one said, leaning on his handlebars like a little mouse caught in a trap. The laughter spread through the group, their voices blending into the steady hum of their idling motorcycles. Another kick sent his school bag skidding across the ground, stopping near the curb. "Maybe he's got something valuable in there," one of the men mused. "Might be worth taking a look." The boy scrambled toward it, desperation clawing at his chest. He didn't have anything valuable, nothing they would want, but that didn't matter. They were playing a game, one where the rules only existed to humiliate him. A hand caught him by the back of his jacket, yanking him up onto his feet with little effort. He barely had time to regain his footing before he was shoved backward. His back hit the side of one of the motorcycles, making it rock slightly before settling again. "Where you going, kid?" The voice was amused, playful in the worst possible way. "We're just getting started." The boy didn't answer. His throat felt tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew better than to show fear. It would only make things worse. But he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. The ringleader, the man with the scar on his cheek, crouched down and picked up one of the fallen books. He flipped through it lazily before glancing at the boy. "You actually read this stuff?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "What's the point? Bet no one even notices a kid like you." The boy clenched his jaw. The biker grinned, sensing he had struck a nerve. He let the book slip from his fingers, letting it drop onto the ground before bringing his boot down on it. The spine cracked. Something inside the boy cracked with it. The world felt smaller, darker, pressing in on him from all sides. He was outnumbered, surrounded, with no one coming to help. And then he saw him. The man from the gas station. He was walking toward them, slow and deliberate, his hands relaxed at his sides. The boy had barely noticed him before, but now, as the bikers turned to glance in his direction, the air itself seemed to shift. The laughter died down. The sneers faded into something else, something more cautious. The man kept walking, his pace unhurried, his gaze steady. He wasn't in a rush, he wasn't afraid. And somehow that made it worse. For the bikers. The boy saw it first, the way their postures changed. They straightened slightly, their amusement giving way to something else, something they didn't want to acknowledge just yet. Uncertainty. The gas station lights cast long shadows across the pavement as the man finally stopped just a few feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that preceded a storm. The boy held his breath. And then everything changed. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It was not the silence of an empty street at dusk, nor the nervous quiet that sometimes stretched between words when people didn't know what to say. This was something else, something heavier. It settled over the gas station lot like a thick fog, swallowing up the remnants of laughter that had, just moments ago, filled the night air. The bikers were still, their engines idling softly beneath them, the low vibrations humming against the pavement. Their amusement, so effortless before, had faded into something more cautious, more aware. Their gazes, once focused solely on the boy, now shifted toward the man standing a few feet away. He was not remarkable in appearance, not in a way that would have demanded attention under normal circumstances. Dressed in a plain jacket, worn jeans, and boots dusty from travel, he looked like any other man stopping at a gas station on his way to someplace else. But there was something about him that made the space around him feel different. He was not tense, not aggressive. His hands rested at his sides, relaxed. His stance was easy, comfortable, but in a way that suggested absolute control. He had walked across the lot without hurry, without concern, as though he had all the time in the world. And now he stood there, simply watching. The boy barely dared to breathe. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable change in the dynamic that had, only moments ago, been entirely in the bikers' favor. They had controlled the moment. They had dictated the events, relished in the power of their numbers, the inevitability of their strength. But now, all of that had cracked, and none of them seemed to know why. One of the bikers, a tall, wiry man with a crooked nose, scoffed under his breath. It was a weak sound, forced, as if trying to break whatever strange tension had settled over them. He nudged his boot against one of the boy's books, sending it skidding a few inches across the pavement. "Something you need, old man," he muttered, but the bravado in his voice had thinned. The man didn't answer. He didn't even blink. The leader of the group, the one with the scar down his cheek, shifted in his seat. His hands tightened slightly on the handlebars of his bike. He was older than some of the others, more experienced, and while he might not have known who this man was, he knew what he was looking at: a professional. There were some men who held themselves in ways that set them apart. Men who did not need to raise their voices, did not need to make a show of their strength. It was there, beneath the surface, in the way they moved, in the way they stood. It was the kind of thing you recognized when you spent enough time around violence, and Scar had spent most of his life surrounded by it. He straightened, subtly adjusting his posture. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, a quiet calculation behind the words. Still, the man said nothing. The boy could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. He had no idea who this stranger was, had no reason to believe he would help him, but something deep in his gut told him that the night had just taken a turn. He wasn't sure how. The others were growing restless. The tension in the air was no longer something they could brush off. The leader exhaled through his nose, then gave a sharp jerk of his chin toward the boy. "Not your problem, friend," he said, his voice dipping into something firmer. "Best keep walking." The man finally moved, tilting his head slightly as if considering the words. Then, in the same calm, measured way he had approached, he crouched down. The boy tensed, but the movement was slow, unhurried. The man reached for one of the fallen books, picking it up from where it lay on the asphalt. The cover was smeared with dust, a few pages slightly bent from the rough treatment it had received. The boy watched as the man brushed it off with a steady hand, as if the small act deserved the same care as anything else in the world. Then, just as slowly, the man rose to his feet and handed it to the boy. He took it hesitantly, fingers curling around the book, his pulse still thrumming in his ears. The bikers exchanged glances. It was such a simple thing, barely anything at all, but in that moment it was a shift in the balance. The leader's expression darkened. "You deaf, old man?" His voice lost its feigned lightness, sharpening into something closer to a warning. The man met his gaze, and then, for the first time, he spoke. "You should leave." 3 words, calm, steady. There was no challenge in them, no threat, but somehow they carried more weight than anything else that had been said that night. The leader's jaw tightened. The men around him straightened, their grips on their handlebars shifting. The air grew taut, drawn so tight that the boy felt like he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. It was not the words themselves that made them hesitate. It was the way he said them. It was the quiet certainty behind them, the unwavering finality. The leader held his gaze, and for a long moment, the world seemed to hang in place. Then, with a sharp scoff, he looked away. "Let's go," he muttered, kicking his engine into life. The others hesitated, but one by one, they followed, their motorcycles rumbling back to life. The leader cast one last look at the man before revving the throttle. "Next time, mind your own business," he said, though the words rang hollow. The man didn't respond. He didn't even watch them go. One by one, the motorcycles roared away, peeling off into the night. Their headlights cut through the darkness before fading, their distant echoes lingering in the air before silence finally returned. The boy stood still, barely comprehending what had just happened. His hands were still trembling slightly as he clutched his book. The man turned to him. His gaze was steady, unreadable. "You all right?" The boy nodded slowly. His voice didn't quite work yet, but he forced himself to answer. "Yeah." The man gave a slight nod. "Get home." And just like that, he turned and walked away, heading back toward his truck as if nothing at all had happened. The boy stood there for a long moment, the gas station lights buzzing faintly above him, the shattered remains of his gift still scattered across the ground. Then, without another word, he bent down, gathered what was left of his things, and ran. A gust of wind swept through the gas station lot, scattering dust and a few loose scraps of paper across the pavement. The engines of the departing motorcycles roared in the distance, their fading echoes the only lingering trace of the gang that had, just moments ago, commanded the space with their presence. Now, in their absence, an eerie stillness settled over the lot, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the sudden shift in balance. The boy stood motionless, gripping the book in his hands. His heartbeat was beginning to steady, though the adrenaline still coursed through his veins, leaving his limbs stiff and unsteady. He could barely comprehend what had just happened. The bikers had been ready to humiliate him, maybe worse, and then, just like that, they had left. Not because they had grown bored, not because they had lost interest. They had left because of him. Because of the man who had appeared without warning and without raising his voice or throwing a single punch, had turned the tide of the night. The boy turned his head slightly, glancing toward the figure who had, in an instant, become something more than just a stranger at a gas station. Chuck Norris stood a few feet away, seemingly unconcerned, as if what had just transpired was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He was adjusting the fuel cap on his truck, his movements slow and methodical. The wind ruffled the edges of his jacket, and the dim yellow glow of the gas station's overhead lights cast long shadows beneath his boots. The boy swallowed, unsure of what to say. He felt like he should thank him, but the words didn't quite form. Instead, he hesitated, lingering in the moment, unwilling to move just yet. Chuck turned slightly, his gaze settling on the boy with the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn throughout the entire encounter. His eyes held no trace of satisfaction, no self-importance. If anything, they carried the weight of someone who had seen too many nights like this before. "You all right?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The boy nodded instinctively, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Yeah," he managed, his voice coming out hoarse. Chuck studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Get home." There was no gentleness in his words, no unnecessary comfort, just a simple instruction, one the boy knew better than to question. He hesitated only a moment longer before stooping down to retrieve what remained of his belongings. His hands still trembled slightly as he gathered his books, brushing dirt from the covers and stacking them neatly. His backpack lay a few feet away, kicked near the curb, the fabric scuffed but intact. He slung it over his shoulder and, after a brief glance at the shattered remains of the glass trinket, turned back toward the road. He took a step, then paused. There was a feeling in his chest, a weight that wouldn't quite settle. He looked back at Chuck, still standing by his truck, and for a brief second, he wanted to say something, anything, to break the strange, heavy silence that had followed the biker's departure. But before he could find the words, another sound cut through the night. A low, deliberate rumble. The boy froze. His breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't distant, wasn't fading into the night like before. It was close. Too close. Then, from the far side of the gas station, a single motorcycle pulled into view. It wasn't like the others. The engine was deeper, the headlights dimmer, almost predatory in their glow. The bike rolled slowly across the pavement, its tires gliding over the ground with eerie smoothness. The rider sat tall in the seat, his posture unnervingly still, as if he were more shadow than man. And then another appeared. And another. The leader had returned. The boy felt his stomach drop. The bikers hadn't left after all. They had only circled back, waiting for the moment when the dust had settled, when the false sense of security had started to creep in. Chuck remained motionless. He hadn't turned his head, hadn't reacted at all, but the boy knew, somehow he knew, that the man had sensed them long before they had come into view. The leader's motorcycle rolled to a stop just a few yards away, the others fanning out behind him. The headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. The sound of the idling engines filled the night, low and menacing. The leader swung a leg off his bike, standing slowly, deliberately. His boots scraped against the pavement as he stepped forward, his gaze locked on Chuck. The boy took a step back, instinct telling him to run, but something in the way Chuck remained still kept him rooted to the spot. The leader exhaled sharply through his nose, his expression dark with something between amusement and irritation. "Didn't like the way that ended," he said, his voice carrying through the lot. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't appreciate people messing with my business." Chuck finally moved. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting the leader's without hesitation. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The leader's jaw tightened. "You think you just walk in, scare us off, and that's it?" He gestured vaguely to the others behind him. "Ain't how this works." The air had changed again. The tension from before had been replaced with something sharper, something more dangerous. The boy could feel it pressing against his skin, thick and suffocating. The other bikers dismounted, moving to stand alongside their leader. The numbers were greater this time, the stakes higher. They had come back for a reason, and it wasn't to talk. The leader rolled his shoulders, exhaling a quiet chuckle. "Let's see if you got more than just a stare, old man." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming, but somehow he got the feeling that Chuck had known all along. The man had never been concerned, never flinched, never hesitated. He had watched, he had waited, and now it was happening exactly as he had expected. The leader took one last step forward. Chuck moved. It wasn't fast, it wasn't sudden. It was smooth, controlled. He shifted his stance, the muscles beneath his jacket rolling with the motion. His posture changed. Not tense, not aggressive, but ready. For the first time, the boy saw something different in him. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon, the first distant crackle of thunder before the sky broke open. The leader smirked, taking another step forward. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything exploded into motion. The night, once quiet and unassuming, erupted into chaos in the span of a single breath. The leader of the bikers barely had time to shift his weight before Chuck Norris moved, not with the reckless aggression of a man looking for a fight, but with the effortless precision of someone who had already won before it had even begun. The first biker lunged forward, the crunch of his boots against the pavement sharp in the air. His swing was wild, fueled more by frustration than strategy, but Chuck didn't flinch. He stepped aside, his movement fluid and controlled, and in the same instant he brought his forearm up, striking the attacker square in the ribs. The force was measured, perfectly placed. Not enough to break anything, but enough to send the man stumbling backward, gasping for breath. There was no hesitation. Another one was already moving, emboldened by the presence of his gang, by the sheer numbers in their favor. He was faster than the first, more deliberate. He feinted left before throwing his full weight into a punch aimed at Chuck's jaw, but Chuck had already seen it before it even came. A sharp pivot, a quick sidestep, then, before the attacker could recover, Chuck's elbow snapped up in a precise arc. It connected with the man's chin with a dull, resounding thud, and his head jerked back. He staggered, his knees buckling, and then he crumpled onto the pavement, groaning. The rest of the gang hesitated. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered in their expressions. This was supposed to be different. There were more of them now. They had come back prepared, ready to teach a lesson, but in just a few seconds, 2 of them were already down, and the man standing in front of them hadn't even broken a sweat. Chuck straightened, his posture as relaxed as ever, as if he hadn't just sent 2 fully grown men sprawling onto the asphalt with nothing more than a few precise strikes. His expression didn't change. He simply looked at the rest of them, calm, composed, waiting. The leader's jaw tightened, his fingers curled into fists. "Get him," he snapped. And just like that, the rest of the bikers charged. The boy, still frozen near the curb, barely had time to process what happened next. It was like watching something out of a dream, something surreal and impossible. 5 men, each bigger, heavier, more physically imposing than Chuck Norris, rushed him at once. But he didn't retreat. He didn't brace himself. He moved. The first one came in with a chain wrapped around his knuckles, swinging for Chuck's ribs. Chuck ducked low, his movement smooth as water, and before the attacker could recover, Chuck's palm shot forward, striking him just below the sternum. The man's breath left him in a painful wheeze, and he dropped the chain as he stumbled back, doubled over. Another one swung a broken bottle, the jagged glass catching the light of the gas station's flickering neon sign. Chuck sidestepped the attack effortlessly, then grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering on the pavement. A second later, Chuck pulled him forward and sent him crashing headfirst into the side of a parked motorcycle. The machine rocked violently from the impact and the man slumped to the ground. The others barely had time to process what had just happened before Chuck turned on them next. A quick shift in weight, a pivot of his foot, and he delivered a powerful spinning kick straight to the chest of the next attacker. The force sent him skidding across the pavement, his back hitting the curb with a painful thud. The boy couldn't look away. It wasn't just that Chuck was winning. It was how he was doing it. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't acting out of anger or spite. Every movement was deliberate, efficient. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary force. He wasn't showing off. He was simply ending the fight before it could even begin. And the bikers knew it. The last two stand and hesitated. They had rushed in thinking that with their numbers this would be easy, that the lone man in front of them would fold under the sheer force of their presence. But now their comrades lay sprawled across the pavement, groaning, struggling to catch their breath, and the man they had underestimated was still standing, unscathed, unimpressed. Chuck looked at them. The taller of the two swallowed hard. His fingers flexed at his sides, but he didn't move. He wasn't sure if he should. The leader, however, was far from ready to give up. He had watched everything unfold, seen every single one of his men fall, but his pride was a wound deeper than any physical one. He reached into his jacket and in one swift motion pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sharp and lethal. The boy's breath caught in his throat. Chuck didn't react, not outwardly, at least. He simply shifted his stance, his eyes never leaving the leader's. The leader smirked, spinning the knife once between his fingers. "What now, old man?" he taunted. Then he lunged. The knife sliced through the air, aimed directly for Chuck's chest. But before it could make contact, Chuck's hand shot out. The movement was almost too fast to follow. 1 second, the knife was coming toward him. The next, Chuck had the leader's wrist in an iron grip, stopping the blade inches from his torso. The leader's smirk faltered. Chuck tightened his grip. His fingers dug into the man's wrist, twisting. Not enough to break, but enough to send a sharp jolt of pain shooting through his arm. The leader gasped, his grip on the knife loosening involuntarily. A second later, Chuck wrenched the weapon free and tossed it to the ground, sending it skidding across the pavement. The leader barely had time to react before Chuck struck. A quick, precise palm to the chest sent him stumbling back, but Chuck didn't let him fall. He grabbed him by the collar, pulling him forward, and with a single, fluid motion, lifted him off the ground. The boy had seen this before. On television, in old wrestling matches. It was a maneuver that looked effortless when performed by professionals, but in real life, it was something else entirely. Chuck turned, using his momentum, and slammed the leader down onto the pavement with a resounding impact. The sound of it echoed across the lot, loud and final. Silence followed. The leader groaned, rolling onto his side, barely conscious. The remaining bikers looked at him, then at Chuck, then at each other. Then, without another word, they turned and ran. Their boots pounded against the pavement as they scrambled back to their motorcycles. A few of them barely managed to swing their legs over their seats before gunning the engines, tearing out of the lot as fast as they could. The roar of their bikes disappeared into the night, swallowed up by the endless stretch of highway. The boy stood frozen, his heart still hammering in his chest. Chuck didn't move right away. He watched as the last of them vanished, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned and looked down at the leader still groaning on the ground. Chuck crouched beside him, his voice low, calm, but firm. "Stay down." The leader didn't argue. Satisfied, Chuck stood and dusted off his jacket, as if shaking off the remnants of the fight. Then, finally, he turned to the boy. "You all right?" The boy nodded, still too stunned to speak. Chuck studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Go home." And with that, the fight was over. The lesson had been taught, and justice had been served. The night had returned to stillness. The echoes of the departing motorcycles faded into the vast emptiness of the highway, their engines swallowed by the wind. The gas station lot, once the stage for an impending act of cruelty, now stood silent, marked only by the groans of the defeated leaders sprawled on the pavement. The air, which had moments ago crackled with tension, felt lighter, as if the very weight of the violence that had threatened to take place had been lifted. The boy remained where he stood, his breathing uneven, his body still caught between the lingering effects of adrenaline and the overwhelming disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He clutched his book against his chest, his knuckles white around its edges. His school bag, kicked around in the chaos, lay a few feet away, partially covered in dust. He hadn't moved to retrieve it. He hadn't moved at all. His gaze drifted to Chuck Norris. The man had not so much as adjusted his stance in the wake of what had transpired. He stood with the same quiet presence he had carried the entire night, exuding neither triumph nor exhaustion. He did not revel in his victory. He did not look down at the man groaning on the pavement with the smugness of one who had proven himself. If anything, there was something akin to disappointment in his expression, though not in himself. It was the look of a man who had seen this too many times before, who understood all too well that it would happen again, somewhere, someday, with someone else. Chuck turned his attention to the leader of the bikers, who was still gasping, his pride more broken than his body. The man attempted to roll onto his side, his face twisted with pain, one hand reaching for his ribs as if to check whether they were still intact. His breathing was shallow, uneven. He looked up at Chuck, his eyes bloodshot with anger, but beneath it, beneath the resentment, beneath the rage, there was something else, something raw, fear. Chuck crouched beside him, resting one arm on his knee, his voice steady. "Stay down," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a statement of fact, as inevitable as the rising sun. The leader swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. He had no words left to throw, no bravado to cling to. For all his bluster, for all his posturing, he had been utterly and completely outmatched. Satisfied, Chuck stood again, brushing the dust off his hands. His eyes flicked briefly toward the boy. "Go home." The boy blinked, as if only now remembering where he was. His hands fumbled slightly as he bent down to collect his scattered belongings. His books were scuffed, but otherwise intact. His bag, though dirty, had survived the ordeal. The only thing beyond saving was the shattered glass trinket, its broken pieces glistening under the fluorescent lights of the gas station. A lump formed in his throat. That had been the one thing he had wanted to keep safe. A simple thing, maybe, but something that had meant the world to him. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the tiny shards. Then, slowly, he crouched down, intending to gather what little remained. A boot gently nudged the pieces aside. The boy looked up. Chuck stood there, shaking his head, his expression unreadable. "Leave it." The boy hesitated again, glancing down at the broken glass, then back up at Chuck. After a moment, he nodded. He pulled his bag onto his shoulder and took a step back. His gaze flickered towards the defeated leader one last time. The man had rolled onto his side but remained motionless, unwilling or unable to rise. Chuck watched the boy for a second longer, as if assessing whether he would be all right on his own. Then, seemingly satisfied, he turned back toward his truck. He moved with the same calm certainty he always had, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a passing inconvenience, something already behind him. The boy should have left then. He should have turned and gone, just as Chuck had told him to. But something held him in place. For years, he had known what it was like to feel small, to feel powerless. He had known what it was like to be ignored, to be underestimated, to have people look at him and see nothing worth noticing. But this had been different. Someone had noticed. Someone had stepped in. Not because they had to, not because they wanted anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That wasn't something the boy had seen often in his life. He swallowed hard. "Mister," his voice caught, and he had to clear his throat before trying again. "Mr. Norris?" Chuck paused just as he reached his truck door. He turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. The boy shifted his weight, suddenly feeling awkward beneath that steady gaze. He didn't know what he wanted to say. Thank you didn't seem like enough. It felt too small for what had just happened, for what had just been prevented. But what else could he say? "Thanks," he muttered, lowering his eyes slightly. Chuck nodded once. "Go home," he said again, but this time there was something almost gentle in his tone. The boy gave a small nod, then turned, his footsteps slow at first before picking up speed. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already seen everything he needed to see. Chuck watched him disappear down the sidewalk, his silhouette shrinking beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. When he was gone, Chuck exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked back toward the man still on the pavement. The leader was staring at him, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His eyes, though still filled with resentment, now carried something else beneath them, a quiet, reluctant understanding. Chuck met his gaze. "Pick better fights." The leader's fingers curled slightly against the pavement, but he didn't respond. He only looked away. Chuck didn't waste another second on him. He opened the door of his truck, climbed in, and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, deep and steady. He reached for the gear shift, glancing once more toward the empty lot where only the broken glass remained. With a final, quiet nod to himself, he pulled out onto the road, leaving the gas station behind. The boy would get home safely. And the town, at least for tonight, had been reminded of something important. Justice didn't always come with sirens and badges. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet form of a man who simply refused to look the other way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more of our videos for more great content, and don't forget to share this video with your friends.